Hey everyone, I am super excited for today's live stream. We've already got a GitHub open source project up available for you. We're going to be learning about authorization. I've got an amazing guest, Alex. We're going to be using Express, JavaScript, and let me hand over to Alex, who can do a much better introduction than me. And while Alex is doing that, I'm going to drop some links for you in the chat. Alex, thank you so much for joining me on the live stream. So what are we doing today, Alex? And please give yourself an intro.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me, Eddie. Super excited to finally join one of these streams. Big fan of the Kubernetes one you did a couple of weeks ago. And yeah, I am Alex Olivier. I'm working on an open source project called Cerbos. And Cerbos is solving a pain I've experienced and my colleagues have experienced in numerous companies over the years around authorization. Kind of before I dive into that, just quickly my background. I'm a hardcore engineer at heart. Studied computer science at uni, and then I've worked at both startups and massive enterprises over the years. And there's been one common thing across working at Microsoft through to smaller companies is you spend a lot of time reinventing the wheel. And one of those wheels that you keep having to redo is authorization. Authorization, for those of you that may be wondering what that means, and is it the same thing as authentication? It's a slightly different problem. So authentication is about working out who your users are. You might be familiar to go and log in with your Google account or your GitHub account, or Auth0 is a big kind of solution out there for authentication, and that really is about identifying who you are. But authorization is the bit that I guarantee every single one of you out there has written into your code base at some point about working out, okay, I've got this user, can they do this thing in my code? Can they go and edit an article or post a picture or mark a comment as spam? Can they add a comment to a live stream? This is this kind of authorization logic, this generally if-else case switch style logic based on what a user can do. And what Cerbos is a completely free, open source, out there on all the channels and all the distribution systems, primarily GitHub, for actually taking that complicated business logic and modeling it in a much simpler way, and that you can plug it into any app you have and have very bulletproof and fine-grained access control without having to go and reinvent the wheel and build it yourself every time.
And Alex is going to show us some interesting things on a journey on how interesting it is, because I'm sure you've probably all done this, right? Can this user, like I'm looking at our Discord chat and I see Naomi's just come online, and Naomi wrote a Becca bot that is used in over 100 Discord servers, which is an awesome bot. I'm really interested to know, hopefully Naomi can join and chat about this a bit, but can a certain person on Discord reset like the stats? We reset our gamification stats, our levels every month. So there's some authorization there, even if it's just like, a simple one. And it's probably done is if this person is a mod, then they can do it. Otherwise they can't do it. And we all start off with if and else, and then probably advance to switch statements, which I think Alex is going to show us today. And then you can advance to Cerbos, which, if I understand correctly, Alex, works for any language, right? We're going to use JavaScript today, but it can be used with any language as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Cerbos is a completely standalone little app or service that you run alongside your application, which encapsulates all this logic, and is a very simple API to integrate with Cerbos. And then we have JavaScript SDKs, we have PHP SDKs, we have .NET SDKs, you name it, we've got it, for simply plugging in and communicating. And today we're going to go through that whole journey and integrating Cerbos into a JavaScript app that uses an Express server to kind of authenticate and authorize some requests.
That's awesome. And we've got Carl here, who also did the authentication and authorization for our API project, which we now have simplified, but at the time we were building that up. So yeah, I'm super excited to learn about this today. And we see, thank you, Sri, if I pronounce your name right. You started the project already, so really appreciate it.
Nice.
It's so interesting how starting an open source project really helps the maintainers just get that motivation to do a bit more. I'm hopefully going to find you all some green squares. I'm already kind of, having a look out for some green squares for all of you, maybe on the example project or maybe on the Cerbos actual project. So I'll be dropping some links for the other projects as well. Shortly. Actually, one green square, if I may, Alex, already is on the Cerbos organization, on the Cerbos repo. Let's open up on the screen. And if you click on the main Cerbos repo, the one that one we just had, I see the wiki link is there. And if you click on the wiki link, I think your docs are not there. So Yes. So what I would suggest, if someone wants a green square, raise an issue and suggest maybe hiding the wiki in the settings if it's not being used. I know Alex was saying to me earlier on, there are docs in another repo. Was that correct?
Right here in the main,
Oh,
there's a doc file.
perfect. The
So
way we love it in Eddie Hub.
contributions.
Yes. So if you notice anything in documentation, raise an issue, raise an improvement. So one green square already, and I'll find some more on the way for all of you to get some green squares as well. So Carl has a thought already. It's great. Carl, like super awesome at open source and all these R projects as well on Eddie Hub, and works for Gitpod. So many amazing open source projects. There's a trend seeing tools in the JavaScript ecosystem written in Go. I think because it can be run as a Docker container. And Alex is going to take us through. I'm not going to make any spoilers. I'll let Alex come to that. Okay, enough from me. Let's get Alex jump onto it. Any questions? Write it in the chat, and we'll go through them as we go through. Alex, over to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, great. So today we're going to go through and essentially build up a application that we have as a repo. If you want to follow along, it's called this demo node Serb finance repo. And this is just a very simple Express application. There isn't a UI, it's just a very simple API. And this is an expenses tracking system. So if you've ever had to send an expense off, maybe at work or something else, where you needed to send in your receipts, and then they get, you input who the vendor was, the amount, the dates, and then get sent off to some finance person who has to review it and then approve it. It's a very simple API for that. And this system has kind of different user roles in it and different actions that you can do on a particular resource. So our user roles, we have our basic user. So as a regular user, anyone that works for a company that needs to submit an expense. So they can go and create expenses, submit them, and then they hope they get their money back at some point. There's also managers, and these are like regional managers. So imagine if you're working in a team in Europe, you might submit your expense, and then the manager of the European team can see all the expenses from their team. Same for, say, North America. You have a finance role. So these are the people that do the actual approval. And then there's a finance manager who kind of oversee the whole of the finance team and have a bit more power to make decisions on that kind of expenses. And then, of course, because every system has one, you have the IT admin, the IT guy or girl, who is the one that has kind of full access to the system because they need to maintain it and keep it up and running. Makes sense? Simple enough?
Yep, sounds good. Super admin.
Yep, super admin, sudo, all that. Everyone has one. And if we look into the actual system, there's a kind of 4 main actions you can take in a particular expense. You can view an expense, you can update an expense, say you want to change the details or the amount. You can approve an expense, and you can delete an expense. So they're the 4 main actions, and hopefully you can already see how this maps back to the different user roles, who's allowed to do what. And we also have this additional kind of condition in here that viewing who approved an expense has some special conditions around it, because you may not want to expose who's gone and denied all your expenses or not. So here's some further logic around who's allowed to see who actually approved a particular expense. So that's kind of the high level of the system, and I'll just jump into code here and show you very simply what the little JavaScript Express app looks like, and then we'll kind of build on top of this. So if it's all big enough for everyone.
Perfect.
Yep.
Looks good.
Cool. So we have a very simple Express app. We're enabling JSON bodies just so we can send data around. And because I didn't want to overcomplicate the demo and implement very complicated authentication systems or anything like that, this simple app is just using a request header. So the authorization header. If you set it to one of the usernames that are in the database, that's who you are in that request. And it just keeps it nice and simple rather than have to go and build a whole user management system. And basically, if you haven't got an authorization header set, we throw an error saying you're unauthorized, otherwise you're good, and we pass that user along to the actual request handlers. Now, we have just 4 handlers that map back to those 4 actions I spoke about earlier. So we have a very simple get method, so /expenses /an ID. So here we're using the URL parameter, and it simply goes through this quote unquote database that I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And it just goes and pulls out the expense from that list of expenses that are built into this demo app. And if it finds it, it returns it. If not, it throws an error. Same thing for patching. So this is doing that update command or update method on a particular expense. You want to update the amount or the date. You do a patch request. To approve, so this is an action for someone that can go in an approved request. It's a simple post request. If you want to delete it, it's a delete request. And that's kind of it. Very simple. The actual implementations aren't here, but to give you an idea of what it kind of looks like. And then our actual database is this db.js file if you're looking at the repo or you've cloned it yourself. And we have different users set up. And users have this structure. So you can imagine this sits in a database or something else. So you have a user, we have an ID, they have a role, and these roles are generally coming from either like your user database or your authentication system or your directory system. Because every user will be a member of different roles or groups inside of a system. And for this particular one, we have 3 different roles. We have a user, we have an admin, and we have a manager, which maps back to those kind of 3 different roles I spoke to earlier. And then we also have some attributes for each user. So what department they're in and what region are they in. So are they in sales? Are they in EMEA or North America? Sajid here has the admin role. He's in the IT team. We have Joe, who's a user in the finance team in EMEA. We have Jamie, who's a user and a manager. So he's should have a bit more power. He's in the finance team in EMEA. And we have Brock here, who's a user and a manager in sales in North America. And then a few kind of other examples. The ones we're primarily going to be dealing with today are Sally, Sajid, Joe, and Jamie. So Sally is our main user that submitted most of the expenses. She's on the sales team in EMEA. So,
sounds good.
So that's what our users look like. And there's some attributes about them. And then equally we have our expenses. So these are the actual things that are stored in the system because previous people have submitted these expenses. And they have a structure of an ID and they have some attributes. So an expense has a field that says who the owner is, so the ID of the person that created the expense. We have the timestamp it was created, and I'm doing some sort of live evaluation of the timestamp just so we get some real time rather than some static hard-coded value, which will be important later.
Okay.
We have some information about who the vendor that the expense was filed against, what region that expense was filed in, the amount and what the status is. And then if it's an approved expense, we also have this approved by field. And so we've got 5 expenses here in different amounts. And that's essentially what our system looks like. Very basic data model and very basic API. So cool. Right now, this will just always succeed. There's no logic, there's no checks in here to work out who's allowed to do what. So we need to go and add some authorization in. So if say you're building this as you're a consultant doing some freelance work, you're building this system, there's a good chance that you might get some sort of requirements document, or you might have an idea in your head of how this business logic should work, and you might end up with a spreadsheet or a grid, which is generally how these things seem to be defined around who's allowed to do what. So the logic that we need to go and implement into our API here is defined in this table. So there's some very simple kind of roles and then the actions against a particular expense. So an admin, unsurprisingly, has a green tick. They're allowed to do everything. They can view, they can see who the approver was, they can update it, they can approve it, they can delete it. A user can view an expense only if they created it. So this is where the first bit of additional logic beyond is this person a user or an admin comes in. So you've got some contextual information you're now going to have to use to make a decision on accessing it.
This is really interesting because we've got a project that people are probably aware of, Linktree. At the moment, it's just managed. It's like Linktree open source alternative, but it's managed with JSON files in the GitHub repo just to get something going. But it kind of went really fast and we're almost at 1,000 stars and so forth. So we're actually going to move it to Next.js, where we're going to have a database behind it. And you're right, if to log in, it'll be GitHub OAuth, nice, simple, straightforward. But then people can only update their profile if it's their profile, that they can't update somebody else's. So again, that will tie in there. I have another question. Well, I don't have another question. Carl has another question. Are you a JavaScript person or are you a Gopher? I replied originally PHP, but likes TypeScript because that's what we had in a brief discussion before we went live.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back further than that. So I started coding when I was 5, and my dad taught me BASIC, like before Windows Visual, like actual
Wow.
BASIC back in the day. And then I went through really obscure languages like Delphi, did some Visual Basic, and then when kind of this whole web thing came around, started learning sort of pure JavaScript back in the day, where you're doing like document.getElementID and document.write to build web pages and these very legacy things. And then built on top of that server-side languages, PHP, definitely done that. But nowadays I'm very much a JavaScript, well, TypeScript is my preference. That's my go-to language, but the Cerbos system that we're going to be talking about is all in Go, so you can do a bit of that. I worked at Microsoft for a bit, so I had to do some .NET, but I try not to remember that too much. But yes, a mixture. I'll give my hand to anything.
But I think you'll get quite a few thumbs up from the community because you're saying you like TypeScript. I like TypeScript as well, but I do a lot of my examples in JavaScript again to include more people. Let's say, like the suggestion today. So poor Alex did want to do the examples today in TypeScript, and I said, "Can we do it in JavaScript? Let's just what do you call it? Let's keep it a bit more inclusive for, I guess, more people." Hey, Avi, thanks for joining. I know it's going to be late for you in Japan, but thank you so much for joining and starring in the repo. Really appreciate it.
Amazing, thanks. Cool. So it sounds like you have your application that already has some of this logic in there where whether you're allowed to do something is conditional based on the thing the user's trying to access. And there's kind of two terms, RBAC and ABAC, you might have heard of.
Yeah.
So RBAC is role-based access control, where based on the role you have, you get carte blanche to do any action on all the resources, because it's just a simple check. Have this person got the role, then let them do something. Whilst ABAC is attribute-based access control, which is you conditionally allowed to do something based on some attribute of the thing you're trying to do an action upon. And ABAC is kind of what Cerbos works on, but if it also does RBAC. But these are the kind of the terms you'll hear a lot if you kind of looked around this space and looking to implement one of these things. A lot of the time you think you need basic RBAC, but if you get really into the nitty gritty, it's generally going to be ABAC.
Could you give an example of ABAC? So RBAC I get. Make an example of both, if you wouldn't mind. Yep. I don't know, like a blog post or like I said, link-free profile or whatever it is. Like what would?
Yeah. So RBAC in like a profile on Linkfree is if you are Eddie, you are the admin of Linkfree, thus you're allowed to do everything. But if you're just a viewer of a profile, you can't do anything. And it's a very simple binary yes/no.
Okay.
ABAC would be more around like this user is trying to edit a link on Linkfree.
Okay.
But the logic says you're only allowed to edit it if it is your profile. So there's an attribute of the thing you're trying to edit, in which case the owner ID has to equal your ID of the person trying to edit. So you're actually looking at the attributes of the individual thing you're trying to interact with to make an authorization decision.
It makes sense. Okay, thank you for explaining that.
No worries. Yeah, and then like some more examples using this expenses system. So to view who approved a particular expense, there's also some logic in here that says they have to create the expense and the status of the expense must be approved. So that's now using those more conditions. And you can get quite granular with this. So some more kind of complex ones for a user to delete an expense, they have to have created it, and it has to be open, and it has to be created in the last hour. So
and that's ABAC. That's correct, right?
This is ABAC because here we're going to be looking at the who created it. We're going to look at the status of it, and we're going to look at when it was created to make a decision. And those are attributes about the particular resource instance. In this case, the individual expense that the user is trying to interact with, and in this case, delete.
That makes sense. Everyone watching, I hope that makes sense to you. Any questions, let us know in the chat, and we will revisit this more as we show the example. I have just dropped the repo we'll be using for this demo, so we'll find you some green squares on that as well. But I'm loving this diagram. This is really good.
Cool. And just quickly kind of run through these other ones, and then we'll actually go and implement these. So like a logic says, a region manager can view an expense if they are the manager for the region that the expense was created in. So you're going back, we have the region attribute of a particular expense to go and check against. And then in the finance department, if you're just a regular finance person, You can view an expense, you can view who approved it, but you can only approve it if it's less than $1,000. And if you're a finance manager, then you can approve any expense, regardless of the amount. So again, using these attributes.
Nice.
So let's go and actually implement one of these. If we go and look at this, the view at expense. So in our app, we have our get handler. And so far in this get handler, we are, based on the request, we're getting the expense that comes back. And you can see kind of the type that comes here. We have all the attributes about it. So our business logic says an admin can view, a user can view if they created the expense, a finance person can view if they're in finance, and if they're a finance manager, and there's some further conditions about the region manager. So let's go and actually implement this. So first up, we're going to go and grab our user from the request, and we're going to go and say this. So we're going to, our request.user object here is the user that's coming back from our database. So we have this object coming back. Let's say if I was authenticating Sajid, and then there's roles attribute. Ooh, get it wrong. And that's just a list of strings of what roles the user has. So our business logic says if you're an admin, then you're allowed to do it. In which case we're going to go ahead and return the expense because that person is an admin. Thus, they should be able to see it. Now, the next one is if you're a regular user, they have to have created the expense. So now we're going to go and check the roles again. And this time we're going to see whether you have the user role. If you do, so we're now going to go in here, and then the business logic, Copilot doing too much work for me.
Yes, exactly. I love Copilot.
So do I, but it kind of ruins demos.
Yes, it's true. But by the way, everyone, we're going to show you how to do it with if else, I think switch statements, and then with Cerbos to simplify a lot of things. So you're going to want to stay for the good part later on. This is the kind of the way that you can do it, and probably the way most people do it. But we're going to show you with any technology, you can make it even simpler using Cerbos behind it.
Yeah, let's see. I don't worry, I'm not going to code all of these live. We'll swap over to another approach very quickly. But if we're going to do this check here where a user is allowed to view it if they created it. So this is the first time we're going to actually look at attributes rather than just roles. Okay. So we know inside this else block, we know that this user is a user, but we only want to actually return the expense if they also created it. So now, I need to turn Copilot off. So if we go to the expense attribute owner ID, wow. Hold on. Disable extensions.
Who here uses Copilot? Let us know in the chat, and let us know.
It.
Yeah, it's awesome, right? I didn't realize how amazing it was. I was on a plane or on a ferry where there's no internet. I was like,
yes.
Where's the autocomplete? I need this.
I know. Okay, it's off now, so it's only myself to blame if it doesn't work. So now we're doing our first place where we're looking at attributes. So we're now looking at the owner ID attribute of the particular expense, and if it is equal to the user ID of the person making the request, then we should succeed, and we should go and return the expense to the browser. And for each one of these blocks, we're going to have to build up this further logic. So same for now if they're a regional manager. So now we need to go, okay, well, a regional manager has the role of manager. So now we need to go and actually look at a request, look at the roles again, and if it includes that manager role. And then we now know they're a manager, but we only can return it now if the expense region is equal to the user's region. So now we're using attributes again to compare whether someone's allowed to do it or not. And this logic is going to keep building up. And keep in mind that this is just for one method, one for the view logic, for the just viewing a particular expense. If we go and look at some of the more complicated ones where we have to do logic around the time-based or the amount-based, we're going to have to drill down and do further logic into it. So I'm not going to go and code all those. I'm just going to jump to this, if you're in the repo, the app.hardcoded.js file, where all this business logic has now been implemented. So here you can see basically what I just did. We're comparing the ID, we're also checking whether it's been approved, and then we have this logic in here that says you're only allowed to see who approved it if it has been approved and you own it. So in this case, I'm actually having to delete the approved by field in the response because we don't want to return it because you're not allowed to see it. Further logic here around like region managers can only see expenses from their region. So checking they're a manager, checking the regions match, then return. And then anyone in the finance department, they should also be able to see it. And if not, we return an error saying you're not authorized. So each of these gets kind of as complicated. If we go to ones down here, where we're actually looking at the value amount, like the dollar amount of an expense to make conditions on. Again, these are all using attributes. There's more logic down here to only check, firstly, you're a user and you're in finance and the amount is less than 1,000, then you can approve it. If you're a manager, you can approve it regardless of the amount. And basically this logic keeps building up and up and up, and kind of the more complicated ones are here where you can only delete it if you're the owner, it is open, and it was created in the last hour. So these are really contextual, and you have to making these decisions. So we have to go and check the ID, the status, we have to go and grab the timestamp it was created, we have to then do the math to go and figure out if this was created in the last hour.
Date time maths are always a real pain.
Yeah, and you get 1 0 wrong, or you get one thing wrong, and suddenly all your authorization logic is broken in your entire app, which is right pain.
That is true. Let's give some shout outs. So, Krish, awesome to have you here. I know we do clash with Francesco and Emma. They invited me to their live stream, but I told them I already had a live stream planned, and they should pick a different time, stop stealing my time. So great question here from Sonaf. I hope I pronounced your name right. I'm really sorry if I butchered it. Copilot will not take our jobs. I'm doing a Twitter space on this, I think, in a couple of weeks. So do not worry. As you use it, you'll see that it's good, but it's not that good. It's not going to replace a developer, and it needs to learn from developers. So don't worry. It's just like powered assisted steering or powered assisted braking. It's there to help. It's not to replace.
Yeah, definitely. The bit I'll add though is I use Copilot more as like an education tool, because it has shown me solutions to something that I was about to code anyway in a way that I was not thinking of at all.
Yeah.
And I've learned new patterns and practices just by seeing what Copilot predicts. And so it's fascinating to see what it comes out with.
Exactly. It's just another perspective. It's not necessarily the right one, or
Indeed.
It's just a good perspective.
Indeed. Cool. So I've just taken this hard-coded version of the app and I started it up. So just node app hardcoded.js, and just to show you what this looks like.
Perfect. Could you
Postman,
make that a bit bigger? Sorry.
Oh, yeah. So Postman, I imagine many of you are familiar with, but it just allows us to throw requests at the server basically and get responses back. So we're using that hard-coded logic, and I'm setting my authorization header as Sally in this case, and I'm going to go and basically throw a request at the server and see what I get responses back. So here I can get I got a response back as Sally. Expense number 2 I can also access because I am Sally. 3 I can access because it's also by Sally, but expense 4 I get an unauthorized logic because I'm not the owner of that request. Equally, if I go and become Joe, so Joe is our finance person. He's not a finance manager, so there's a limit to what he can approve. But if we now go and actually try and approve some expenses, no, it's always live demos. Bear with me.
No worries. While you're doing that, everyone, don't forget to check out the example repo. It's open source, but also don't forget to check out. I can even bring it up on the screen. Alex, let me know when you're ready. Mm-hmm. I think you're ready. You ready again? Well, not yet. No, yeah. If you need more time, I can still do screen share and I can show everyone that this is the demo app they're working on. And so the README might need improving. Just as we go through this, have a look at the repo, see what you think improvements can be made. Again, here's the wiki not being used. I think an issue could be raised for that. This is on the official Cerbos organization, so they want this repo to look good. As you know, I always make suggestions on if you're not using releases, let's hide it for now. Same with packages. I know this is a new repo, so we'll give Alex a break. And then there's the main repo as well. I will share that in the chat too. So this repo looks really good. I've seen it's got end-to-end tests. It's got lots of awesome stuff. So do have a look at this. Okay, Alex, I'll switch back to your screen.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just cleaned up a couple of bits which I missed. So excuse me.
No worries. We've got to keep it real and authentic. If it works first time, it's not real. It's probably a video where you've edited out.
Indeed. My server keeps crashing.
But no worries. If you need more time, we can pair with you and try and help. Carl always fixes my bugs on live streams. So Carl, I'm looking at you, but I know I've been switching off Alex's screen, so you probably didn't see it. Carl has probably already created this repo locally and running it. Probably Git-podified it as well. So therefore, there is a pull request. Oh no, wrong repo. Sorry, it was the Cerbos repo.
Cool.
But yeah, already probably fixing stuff.
So we're going to bounce over now to the alternative way of doing this, and this is where Servos comes in. So all this business logic right now is all code, and this is great in numerous ways because firstly, all your logic is kept inside your application and is alongside of it. But this has a few kind of pitfalls. One is if someone that maybe not be a developer, maybe on a different team, or maybe an outside contributor that is kind of defining who's allowed to do what inside of a system, then there is kind of a blocker there. If you want to change the business logic around who's allowed to do what, someone's going to have to go in, probably raise a ticket or raise a PR to go and change this business logic, and that is going to be a whole process because you've got to build, test, and then release and deploy the thing. So, and the other way to approach it, and the way that Cerbos works, is that you actually extract this business logic out into something that's a bit more human readable and doesn't require code and doesn't require a developer to define, so that you can actually start handing this off to maybe there's someone you're working with or pairing with who understands the business logic a bit more and understands the requirements a bit more, and they can just make these changes in something outside of the code base, and then in your app code, you just basically check the logic against Cerbos, which contains that business logic.
I love that. That's really great because you're bridging the gaps between the developers aren't holding the keys to everything, and you don't always have to do a deployment for it, and you're bridging the gap between other members in the team and getting other people to contribute. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm going to show you now is very quickly a diagram for just how Cerbos kind of conceptually works, and then we'll dive into a real world example.
Okay.
So we're all developers here. We're all focused on building this application block. And this is where you're writing your Express server, hopefully with fewer bugs than mine. And this is where your business logic sits, and it's handling requests, it's checking you're authenticated, it's going to do things with the database, etc. So you have your users. They're accessing your API, your application, via maybe an app or a browser or some other mechanism. And a request comes in to your application. And today, your application takes that request, it figures out that user's identity because they've logged in. Maybe they're using Google login or GitHub login or an external service like Auth0 or something. And your application also maybe knows what role that user has because you've got a database table maybe somewhere in your code that says this person is an admin of Linkfree, or this person is just a user of Linkfree. And there's that kind of identity and roles information. Your application also knows a second bit of information, which is the actual resource that user is trying to access. So inside your application, there's a number of data sources that it's fetching. It could be from a database, it could be from an external API, maybe using something like Firebase, but there's the actual resources that user is interacting with. And as we've seen through the kind of example I was showing you, in most cases today, inside this application block, you have that big if-else case switch style statement where you're doing horrendous things with dates, timestamps, and figuring out intervals and all that nightmare with new date and hope for the best to work out what's going on. So the service model, as I was kind of saying, is to decouple that. And we are in a world now where everything is becoming more and more of a decoupled service. And that's why things like Kubernetes for managing your different services that are running are becoming so popular. And also nowadays to build an application is much more like Lego, where you get these blocks off the shelf and you stack them together and you can remix them and you can have the exact same set of Lego bricks as someone else, but you build something completely different because of the way you've plumbed them together. And so Cerbos is that Lego block when it comes to authorization. So when your stack is using, say, Auth0 or Firebase authentication for authentication, it's using an API for fetching data, say, about the weather, and then it's using Cerbos as an API for the authorization piece to make sure whether you can edit the data inside of your system. So the Cerbos box here on the right is that decoupled service. The way you kind of pick up and run Cerbos, if you're familiar with Docker, it's just a Docker container that you can run alongside your application. If you're in using something like Lambda, you can deploy this on AWS Lambda. It's fully stateless and containerized, and you can run it anywhere.
Nice.
It doesn't require any storage. It doesn't require any hefty services. It's just a standalone thing that can run anywhere in your stack. And we have kind of users using it in every cloud and every deployment model possible. There's even physical hardware on the world running Cerbos on the actual physical boxes that they send to users, which is quite cool.
Wow, that is really cool. It sounds a bit like the curl project is just used everywhere as well. So this is super interesting. I can't wait to see how it works, how we can tie in, and you're making it sound super cool. And I just can't, I don't know about everyone else. I'm really excited. I'm already thinking, how can we tie it in? And where do we change these permissions and stuff like that? So I'm so excited.
Yeah, absolutely. So how this kind of goes is you have your Cerbos application and the Cerbos instance running somewhere in your infrastructure or architecture or on your local machine, doesn't really matter where. And the Cerbos instance itself takes in policies. So policies is what we're going to go through, and we're going to define our business logic as a policy. And if you're familiar with YAML, spoilers, you'll be able to write Cerbos policies. And those policies can be stored in a few different places. It could be in a database, it could be on disk or like in S3, or our favorite is in a Git repo. And you can do that.
I was going to ask
GitOps.
that. You read my mind. I was like, that's green squares for people. So interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So your policies can go through that nice GitOps workflow that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where you do the usual PRs and code issues and all those sorts of things, but you're doing it on policy definition rather than your application code.
That sounds great. Okay, I have two more questions, but I'm going to let Carl go first. So,
Sure.
Carl, can you use this as a SaaS service, or do you have to always self-host it? Great question.
So the open source core, the version that's out there on GitHub is self-hosted. And that's not because we're being lazy, because we don't want to run a cloud service. It's actually because performance and speed. You don't want to be... Authorization, unlike authentication, can't really be cached. Because when someone logs in, you can have a session for like 30 minutes and you check it once and that's it. Authorization, particularly when it's attribute-based authorization, where you're looking at attributes about individual resources, you're going to be checking on every single API call or multiple times in a single API call. So you want that request to be snappy. And Cerbos itself will return decisions sub-milliseconds, like much below a millisecond. And you don't want to be doing that over the internet, because now that sub-millisecond decision is now going to take 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, God knows how many milliseconds, based on how you deploy it. So actually, it's self-hosted purely for your own performance characteristics. We want Cerbos to almost feel like a database. When you write a SQL query, you don't really think about this is going to be slow. It's sitting usually deployed in, say, AWS right next to your application. It's going to be quick. So that's kind of why we are working on the model of you self-host Cerbos today.
No, that makes sense. Carl agrees as well. So my question is, can multiple apps use the same installation of Cerbos? So if I've got, Linkfree 1, Linkfree 2, and other projects as well, API and so forth, do I just have one Docker container installed in my Kubernetes cluster and multiple apps can use that?
Yeah. So that's actually a perfect transition. So when you make that request from your application to Cerbos, you're passing along 3 bits of information. Okay. You're passing across the principal. So what's the resource type that the principal is who's making this request. So your user ID, some attributes about that user. So we saw in this example, the department and the region. The resource, so what thing are they trying to interact with? And that could be a resource for application A or application B. It doesn't matter where that's defined. And you pass in the list of actions that the user is trying to do against it. So this principal is trying to do this action on this resource. Cerbos then checks all the policies, makes that decision in less than a millisecond, and returns back a very simple yes, no. So that big, complicated if-else case switch style statement you saw earlier now becomes a very simple one-line API call, which returns back a Boolean, yes or no. Are they allowed to or not? And that has two major benefits. One is because your policies is now independent from your code base, your policies can change independently of your code. So when your business requirements change, someone on your policy or Git repo changes the business logic. So let's say now the finance team can approve invoices up to $1,500 rather than $1,000. It's a one-line change in the policy, push that to the Git repo. Your Cerbos instance picks up that change automatically, and your application now starts responding that way without you having to go through a whole code release process, which for larger organizations is a game changer. Because if your change request takes 3 months in a big company, which is not totally unreal, that brings a whole different level of collaboration, because now you can bring more like business users as part of your process rather than just having to do everything in code.
I know you're building up to this, and I want to kind of raise the head if I may. Is it possible to bring an example of what it looks like we have already, the if else, and what the final thing looks like? I know you're going to show us the policies, but let's just to kind of like tease everybody. So let's just confirm what we have at the moment, like if else is. It looks kind of big, and as it gets more complicated, it's going to get bigger, and people to understand and follow it through and all the rest.
So I think this is the best one.
Yeah.
This delete, where we like for an admin, you can do it. If you're a user, you have this check. If you're a manager, and if you're in finance, then you can do it. But then if you're an owner, check the status. Then you do this crazy stuff with dates and probably get the units wrong, like I always do. And then it goes off and then finally makes a decision. In the Cerbos world, we simply package up that information. So the principal, who the user is, the resource, so the individual expense that this user is trying to delete, and the action of delete. And then you send that off, and you simply get is allowed, delete, then that's just a Boolean, and you simply return it, or you return an error, and that's it.
That's that's beautiful. It's just so much simpler. And then it's going to be consistent, right? Because we're going to see this in other places. It's going to be the same logic. Yes, it's different data that you're sending through to the check resource, but in terms of once people understand one, they can understand all of them. It's going to be the same style and consistent throughout, which I think is
yeah.
awesome.
The only thing that's actually different here between the delete and the post for approve is the action value. In here it's delete, here it's approve, but everything else we're sending is exactly the same user information, the same expense. There's no checks for what your role is. There's no checks for the the attributes we're talking about. That's all handled inside of Cerbos and then inside of policies, which we can jump into now.
Yeah, you take the lead. So I just got a bit excited, and I just thought, see some code and see what it was from and to. So now Alex will explain how to get to that from and to position to simplify it.
So what you see on the screen now is the Cerbos playground, play.cerbos.dev, and this is a web-based sort of pseudo IDE, which allows you to actually experiment and prototype and build policies. It also gives you a sort of prototype server for you to wire up Cerbos to your application to without having to run the thing in your infrastructure anywhere. Because we want to make that, that experimentation and sort of testing as easy as possible without having to worry about Docker or anything like that. So what I've already done in this example is on this right-hand side, we've loaded up the different resources and the different users that we were talking about in our demo app. And these are the exact same definitions you saw earlier. So we have like Sally, she's a user, she's in sales in EMEA. We have Sajid, he's in admin in the IT department. We have Joe, who's a user in finance in EMEA. And then below we have sort of expenses, just the 5 different ones, exact same ones in the demo app. And what we have below here is we actually show you, based on the policies you've been defining, what the current result is. So you get live feedback as you start defining this business logic.
I love that. So what I'm going to do, by the way, everyone, I'm going to share the play link in the chat as well.
Amazing. Yeah, the one you're going to get in the chat is the final version with all the policies defined, but we're going to go and build up to that.
Okay, so no cheating, everyone.
Well, I'll be copy and pasting. What's it? Good developers copy, great developers paste. So Cerbos, you define your policies in YAML files. If you're familiar with Kubernetes, which I know has been a topic for you all recently, these are very familiar to you, hopefully, same sort of structure. And And in here, we define our resources, we define our business logic. So I've already gone and created a very basic expense resource policy. And so this is a resource policy for the type of an expense. And we're now going to go and build up our rules. So our first rule, if we go back to our nice grid, is that our admins can do everything. So our first rule is a very simple wildcard action. So for all actions, if you have the role of admin, you're allowed to do everything. If we look down here on the right, our IT Sajid guy is looking at different expenses, and all the actions, view, update, approve, delete, etc. are allowed. And just to show that this is live, if I were going to actually say deny, if I can type.
Oh, nice, you get the preview immediately at the bottom right. So that's an awesome playground, so people can straight away see.
Yeah, spent a lot of time building this just because we really want you to get a nice environment to try things out. So the next action is view. If you remember, we had this business logic around viewer if under certain conditions, and those conditions are, firstly, if you created the expense, you can view it. If you're the manager for the region the expense was created in, you can also view it. If you're in finance or a finance manager, you can view it. So this first one, which is you're allowed to view it if you're the owner, is now we're going to look at the attributes. So if you think through what that looks like, we have information coming in here about the resource. We have these attributes. We have the owner ID. We also know the ID of the person making the request. So we need to compare those. And the way you can do this is a few different ways. You can start writing conditions. So we have this expression format where you can write these conditions. There is autocomplete, and you get feedback at the bottom around kind of what's going on. And we're going to actually start defining some basic conditions. So now we want to look at the information on the request coming in to make a decision whether something's allowed or not. And we want to do this for the user role. So if we use that first example, if you're a user and you can only view it if you are the owner of it. So we're actually going to go and look at the request attributes. Request resource attributes. And this is all kind of documented, of course.
Have you got a typo?
Thank you.
No worries. It's usually me making the typos and people in the audience telling me I've gone wrong. So it's good that I can add value back in return now.
And this is actually going to be short syntax. And we're going to say if the request resource owner ID is equal to the ID of the principal, so the user making the request, then it should be allowed. And I always misspell principal. Cool. So now if we look on the right here, so I am currently Sally. My ID is Sally, and my expense one here, the owner ID is Sally. If we look here, the view resource, the action is allowed. But if I were to go to a resource that's owned by, say, Joe, it's going to be denied.
Nice.
So this business logic that was in that spreadsheet is now being converted into this definition format. So it's YAML for defining what the rules are. And this sort of basic Boolean logic is something called CEL, a common expression language. It's an open source Google framework for basically defining sort of Boolean logic. And you can do simple things like, does this value equal this value? But you can also check that a value appears in a list, or you can check timestamps, spoiler, or other things like this. And the important bit here is Cerbos doesn't know about this particular resource. It doesn't know about the particular user. It is just using the inputs that it's being sent on the right here to make its decision in real time. And that's important because when you want to make those contextual decisions around amounts of the value of an expense or the time of day a request was made, that you can't pre-compute that. It has to be done dynamically and live as the requests are made.
Yeah, I think people will be familiar with this from maybe GitHub Actions and other places as well. So it's good that you mentioned it. I didn't know it was called that, so that's actually really interesting to know. So I'm learning so much in this live stream. So thank you so much.
It's a super cool language that you can just drop into basically anything for defining this logic. So that's for the view action, and we had other ones like approve and approve and delete and update, etc. And rather than me writing all those, typing those out by hand, I'm going to jump over to another instance of the playground where this is all written out for the sake of time, just to kind of show you a few sort of neat things that go on inside of Cerbos that make your lives so much easier when you're writing code. So first off, I'm going to introduce the concept of derived roles. So when a user inside of your application database there might be a user, an admin, or a manager. And those are the three roles that user has, and that's what you would send over to Cerbos saying, I've got this user, they're an admin, they're trying to access this resource to do this action. Is it allowed, yes or no? But in the case of the one we just wrote, where we want to check the owner ID and the principal ID, we can kind of create this like derived role, we call it, of an owner. So an owner is going to be contextual based on the request. So Cerbos will check the request coming in, and here we give it a condition of, if the resource attribute owner ID is equal to the principal ID, then in the context of just this one request, we grant that user an extra role of owner.
Got you. Okay.
Same thing for like a finance role, which will grant you if you are a user and your department is finance. And a finance manager, same thing as if your parent role, so the role coming from your application is a manager, and you're in the finance department, you're now a finance manager. And then you're a regional manager if you are in a manager role, and the region of the resource you're trying to access is the same as the region of the person making the request as well. So we are like dynamically giving you roles just for the context of that one request, which allows you to kind of abstract lots of this business logic away.
And I guess can we reuse that elsewhere as well? Is that the idea? Perfect.
Absolutely. So that was a derived roles sort of definition file, and now we're back into our main policy file. So this is from the other example. If you're an admin, you can do all actions. Now, to be a viewer, before I had the logic coded in here, but now I'm simply saying you're allowed to view if you're an owner, you're in finance, or a regional manager, which matches what our business logic says over here.
Perfect. So that makes it a lot cleaner. So now we can focus. If someone wants to say, hey, if you're an owner, they can use that somewhere else, but they don't have to specify every time the owner is the person who's coming in. Is it matched? It's just taken care of. So
yeah, don't repeat yourself.
Exactly. So when you're contributing to an open source project, and this is in a GitHub repo, people can just say, look, if this person's the owner, I want them to have access to this resource. They don't have to think like, how do I define if they're an owner or not? Maybe the people who started the project have already defined that. It might need updating in the future, but 99% of the time it is there already for people to use. Again, like you said, the Lego building blocks. We've got Lego building blocks, but now we're kind of joining a couple of building blocks together that people can kind of already use as well. So that's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And you say that maybe the definition might need to change. The advantage now, because all your business logic is extracted out into like a one repo that contains all of these rules and these policies, you change it in that one repo once, and no matter where in your code base you're checking permissions, or if you're like a microservices architecture with services in different languages, you might have some JavaScript, you might have some Python, you might have some Java. If your rules change, you're now going to have to go into every single point in your application where you're checking that business logic, the authorization logic, and not only change it in your app once, you're then going to have to like convert that in your head now into some Python code and change the logic in Python, and then do the same in your Java code base.
That's so true.
So this decoupling sort of extracts all that complicated business logic out, and as we kind of teased earlier, your application does a simple check. I have this user, this resource, trying to do this action, yes or no, and Cerbos will return you a yes or no based upon exactly that and what policies are currently live. So let's go down to the fun date example. That's always a nightmare to code.
Yes.
Or a couple of examples that are more interesting, I guess, let's say. So going back to RBAC and ABAC, our simple RBAC is modeled here. If you have the role of admin, you can do everything. That is RBAC. Role-based access control. You have an admin, do everything. Attributes access controls, now we're checking the context and we're checking exactly what you're trying to access. So our rules for our approving a particular expense stated that if you are just in the finance role, so you are a user and your department is finance, we derive that you are a finance role. We give you that extra role, but we have some conditions. We have actually multiple conditions that need to be met. So we're matching all of these conditions. If the amount is less than $1,000 and the particular owner of the resource that's trying to be approved is not owned by yourself, aka you can't approve your own expenses.
That sounds very familiar. So I
Yes.
tried to approve my own pull request, and GitHub said, "No, you're the author of this pull request. You can't." So this makes so much sense. I can definitely relate to this. So that's awesome.
100%. So here we're just defining, again, using this common expression language, this very simple logic, to say the threshold is $1,000 now, and you're not the owner. And then the time-based example we were talking about earlier, there's some checks here to do a delete. So you have to be the owner. The status has to be opened, and then the time since, based on the timestamp and current timestamp, has to be less than 1 hour.
So that's really clean. That date time thing is super clean because it's usually most of the time, all the time, not. So I really like that. Like that itself is just freaking awesome.
Yeah, and just to kind of show you this sort of in action as we kind of look at our different users and our different expenses, we're getting different results. And we have this nice sort of matrix view if you press check all.
Oh, wow. That's pretty cool.
You can see exactly what the permissions are. And that example that you're using the times, in this environment, we have actually hard-coded some dates in, which are like from last year, because that's when I built this example. And the actions are going to be denied because it's more than an hour ago. So it's always going to be denied. If I update to those timestamps, the action would now be allowed. And that's sort of how it works.
That's awesome. Can you leave that on the screen for a moment? I've got a task for everyone listening. So everyone listening, thank you so much for being here still. We're still going to continue. This is super exciting. But I want Alex to pull a YouTube face. I'm going to pull a YouTube face, and I'm going to leave this on the screen. If someone could take a screenshot, tag us, and for someone who adds some tips to the tweet, I'll like all of them. I promise you I will like all of them. But for someone who adds some tips from what you've learned today, I will reshare it on my Twitter, which is over 70,000 people, to get all of you some more subscribers or followers as well. So YouTube face, Alex, we'll hold it for a few seconds. Everyone can take their screenshots. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay, hopefully someone got a screenshot. I love this matrix. This is like awesome because it could be part of the documentation as well. Like in the README, people could screenshot this so you could clearly see someone coming to the project. Right, I can clearly see different roles and the different actions and so forth. That's awesome. Love that.
So the final piece of what I'm going to touch upon is actually the implementation side of things. And this playground makes it nice and easy for you as well, because we have this try the API button. And we generate all the code you need in different languages to support this. So we have, I've mentioned at the start, SDKs for all the common languages out there. And we also run what we call like a demo PDP. So PDP is Policy Decision Point, because everything's got to have an acronym these days. And this is, as it kind of says in red, this is a design for prototyping, not for production, because your checks are going to be going out of the internet. Thus, they will be slow relative to running it locally. But if we go to the JavaScript one, because obviously that's what we're talking about today, it kind of runs you through the process of either doing it server side or client side. It gives you like the npm install commands, and it gives you the snippets to go and drop in and wire it up to this live instance that we have here. And then it also shows you that kind of check resource call that I showed you earlier to go and do this. So if we go and jump over to our code base again, at the top here, we've just gone and grabbed the Cerbos node package. We're using something called gRPC for the server-side implementation. It's just a technology to talk to APIs. Don't need to know much about it beyond that. We point it to the Cerbos demo example. We tell it which playground instance, and that's just the URL that was from there. And now it's now all connected up. And then our application code, we just say we've gone and got the expense from the database. And then before just returning it, we now go and say, Cerbos, go and check this resource. We pass in the user information, so that printable block with the ID and the attributes about the resource and the region of the department. We pass in the resource, which is the expense. The only thing I'm adding here is the kind value, just so Cerbos knows which policy to check. And then it's just the whole block of resources. And then the actions that we want to check. So can this person view it? And also can they view the approver? And this whole block, as I mentioned earlier, is exactly the same for every check here. So you can obviously abstract this out, make this much shorter so you don't have to repeat it in your code base. But for simplicity, it's all in each handler here. And then in your logic before, rather than that big if then else, you just get the decision back from Cerbos. You then do a simple check. Is this person allowed to do the approve action in this case? That returns true. Thus, you would do the action and then return something to the user. If not, unauthorized. So
nice.
If I go and start up this Cerbos instance.
So not hard coded this time. We're going to be using it real in the playground URL. So you probably want an environment variable, maybe where you could, an environment variable where you could set if it's going to use the playground, if you want to test things out, or when you deploy, you probably want it to use. Not probably, you definitely want it to use your own version of it. So I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. So my request this time is taking a bit longer because remember we're going out over the internet now to check against the Cerbos PDP that we're running, but the application performs kind of as you expect. So this is our Joe guy who's trying to approve expenses and getting approved and denied and these sort of things. And the reason why expense number 4 is denied, just to show you this is live. Expense number 4, 3. 3 here is currently open and it's $12,000. And our business logic says that if the expense is less than 1,000, then it's going to be denied. If I were to go and change this to say 100,000, I'm really testing the demo gods here. Save this instance. Behind the scenes, this is being updated on the demo kind of example instance.
Sorry, question. How do you know when that's kind of like ready to test and use in your application?
So in the playground, it takes about 3 or 4 seconds.
Okay, so it's quick.
Yeah. On your local instance, you'll actually see in the console output for Cerbos that it's reloaded the policies.
Got you.
And it's not worked.
Might need a bit more time.
Possibly. Or my business logic has changed in a way that I didn't expect.
Well, it wouldn't. What do you call it? It wouldn't be a live stream. It's the second bug we've had, which is good because it shows it is a real live stream and isn't a recorded video played as a live stream. Well, it worked.
It was a human error. I was doing 3, not 4, not 3. Sorry. So now this time I'm getting the actual response back rather than an unauthorized error, and that's because my business logic has now changed, and my business logic has changed without me having to change my code, which is the key thing that's different in this approach.
That's really good. So you can, just change it. It doesn't affect your code. You have to do a deployment. It will be a change to your Cerbos config, but it's not deploying your whole application. You're not doing, running any migrations. You're not doing anything like that at all. So it's going to be a simpler deployment, which I think is really awesome. I love the abstraction.
Yeah, there are a few kind of other side benefits, which if you're working in like a bigger organization, firstly, collaboration being like the first thing is obviously the big one because your business logic and your policies are defined independently. But going back to this diagram, because there's now one single point where all your business logic is held and all decisions are being made for who's allowed to do what, there's now a single point where all decision is captured. So you will have a clean, consistent log of at this time, this user tried to do this action and it was either approved or denied. And you'll get that consistent output and that consistent logging, regardless of whether that's from a JavaScript service or a Python service or some async queue worker happening somewhere in the background. Because all decisions are in a single point, then you'll get that clean, consistent output, which for those of you working in companies that may be dealing with data security, fun and auditing and all this sort of thing, that gives you a real kind of benefit for that.
I'm really, really liking it. I love the playground, love the abstractions of the roles as well. I think that's, really, really awesome. And I'm going to share also, I've shared the playground link, but I am going to share again the demo project so people can see that. And you're in the demo project, do you have the policies? Yes, you do. Perfect. So people can see that as well.
Yeah, and if you have a Docker running on your local machine, there's a start script. You can just run the shell script, which pulls the Cerbos instance and starts it up and runs all the policies from this folder. Also, if you go to that playground URL, in the top right-hand corner, you'll see a button that says duplicate and save. and that will create a copy of that environment where you can start experimenting as much as you want.
That's awesome.
And the only thing you need to do in the app.cerbos.js file is just update this reference to point to your environment. And if you're running it locally, it's already commented out here. You just uncomment that line, and that will wire it up to your Cerbos instance that's running on your machine.
Perfect. I do see a couple of open source suggestions before we go to questions in the chat. So anyone wants some green squares, I'm sure Alex won't mind. You could install, and Carl, you're gonna have to remind me the name, the env library. I can't remember what it's called now. So you can have, is it Node.env? I can't even think. But I just it's is it .env? I can't remember, but everyone knows which one I'm talking about. The one where you have config. Yes, .env. So you could have one for the playground instance. You could have one for local or playground. Like Boolean or something like that. And so people could switch between those two. Again, make it a bit easier. Always about making improvements. I'm sure Alex won't mind some of those. But here's a question from people in chat. So Carl, I was wondering, what's the thinking behind the decision of a developer of dev tooling is to use YAML over JSON? Oh, Carl, you're asking a dangerous question here. YAML versus JSON is like Angular versus React. Actually, that's a good question, though. I'm going to slightly reword it. I really like YAML, maybe because of GitHub Actions. I've kind of got used to it, and now getting into Kubernetes as well. So I know a lot of devs do like JSON over YAML. So my question is it only in YAML, or can it be done? Do you accept like different formats?
It will accept JSON as well if you prefer that. It does both. We use a library behind the scenes to basically read the files.
Sure.
The reason we kind of use YAML in our documentation is because of that alignment with like Kubernetes, because this is really like an infrastructure piece that you can deploy into your stack. So you just wanted to make it as familiar as possible for the teams that are more dealing with infrastructure rather than, say, the React app side of things.
Makes sense. But JSON's there's available, so people, the web devs who want to use this again to abstract things for their Node environment or whatever environment they're using. But I'm talking about Node, that's what we're using. Then they can do it in JSON. So that's I like that. It also got me thinking. I'm thinking we could also. Yes, that's my question. So we've written policies, how do we deploy it to our Docker container? The reason why I say that is me being a CI/CD, really excited about that. I'm thinking when you have this separate repo that manages this, you can also have a GitHub action that then, once it's been approved and merged in, it could then deploy it as well.
Absolutely. So we support many different storage backends. I mentioned this earlier.
Okay.
The simplest one is a folder on your disk. So if you're developing locally, as soon as Cerbos sees a file change on your disk, it will reload those in. That's great for easy, quick development and testing and iteration, but it's not what you want to do in production, obviously. So for more production use cases, if you want to have like a whole GitHub action workflow that grabs your policies, a thing we haven't touched upon is there's a whole testing framework, so you can write unit tests for your policies as well.
Carl will be happy with that.
There's very solid matrix testing, so it will test every single combination of user and resource inside of the flow. We have published GitHub Actions as well. So if you go to the marketplace, there's Cerbos GitHub Actions, and that will allow you to build, sort of compile and test all your policies, and then the final step of that flow could be upload those policies to an S3 bucket or a GCS bucket or any sort of S3 compatible storage layer. And then in your Cerbos configuration, when you launch the server, you basically point it to that storage bucket. So there's a config file that runs alongside. And that's for the sort of blob storage backend. But sort of my preference is the Git-based backend. So in your server configuration, you give it the Git repo, you tell it what branch or directory to pull from, and then you give it a token to actually authenticate it, because you probably want to keep these things private, as it is your authorization logic. And it supports both Git, HTTP, and SSH. And you also define like what the update interval is and these sort of things.
Oh, that's awesome. So you probably don't even need that complication, right? It's going to get it from GitHub. That is so simple. I absolutely love that.
So the way we kind of recommend it is you sort of have your main branch as production. You make sure you have all the blocks in place, and not anyone can just merge to main. On every pull request, you run the GitHub Actions templates we have.
I just shared the links to that in the chat as well.
You got them already?
There are two GitHub Actions available. One's compile and one is set up.
Yeah, and there's the documentation here of what you can put into your workflow YAML file. And yeah, you just basically run this in every PR, make sure everything can pass properly, so syntactically correct, and then also run all the tests to make sure they all pass. And then you'll let your PR go. It will land in the master branch or the main branch, and then your deployed Cerbos instance will pick up in a few seconds that's changed, pull down the local policies, and then start using them in their actual serving layer.
Sounds good. So yeah, similar to Kubernetes, most people are using YAML a lot of the time. I think, go on, Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, as I say, Carl, one of the other kind of reasons, though, it's not there yet, why our policies are defined in such a way that they follow kind of the Kubernetes style, is we wanted them to be actual like Kubernetes compatible for potentially down the road doing a Kubernetes operator. Nice.
That sounds quite interesting. I like that. Because at the moment now, if someone wants to deploy it via Kubernetes, they have to write their own. Is there not a recipe? What's it called?
We have a Helm chart.
Helm chart, that's the word.
Yeah. So in Kubernetes, there's kind of two ways to deploy it as well. If you're getting into that world, you can deploy it as a service with a load balancer in front, or actually because these things are stateless and can run anywhere, you can run it as a sidecar to your main pod, inside your main pod. So every time your application scales up, every instance that gets scaled up will get its own Cerbos instance. That way you're not going to be fighting for resources. Every instance of your app will get its own Cerbos instance as well.
I hadn't got into sidecar yet, so I just learned something new about what that is. So that's super interesting. Okay, got you.
Yeah, this will dial around forms like that. But yeah, my background and the rest of our team's background is building high throughput, low latency data processing systems. So we were doing 500,000 requests a second. And so we built this thing to work at that level.
That's awesome. So I have another question. I'm sure others in the chat will do. Everyone, do ask your questions in the chat, and we're going to try and answer them. My question is, can we have a look at some tests? I'm really keen to see kind of how that looks.
Yes. So inside of policies, we have this testing set up. So you define a test suite. You give it. Sorry, it's probably a bit small. There we go.
Thank you.
You define kind of your test principles. So they have IDs, they have roles, they can have attributes, much like your actual users would. You then have your different resource types. So they have IDs, they have a resource kind, they have attributes as well. And then your tests, you give it a name, you define the different inputs. So for these users and these resources and these actions, this is what the expected output is. So for Alicia, on the Alicia album, the view should be allowed, the delete should be allowed. Same for Bradley. But you can test every single combination, and Cerbos will actually do a lot behind the scenes to test every single combination as you would expect. And there's some further logic in here, and you can even do references as well. So you don't have to keep repeating your code all over the place.
That's great.
We already talked about the environment here. And if you actually define your tests in the playground as well, which unfortunately this example doesn't, though I will try and add some, you will actually get the test output in the output down here. So you can run your tests in the playground also.
That's very cool. So people can then see if the changes they're making, break any tests, which might be correct. They might want to update the test, but hopefully they're doing it test-driven development. But it's just a great visibility and makes it super robust. It's a great way for people to contribute to open source projects. If anyone needs any green squares, you could write some tests for the demo project that Alex has gone through today as well. It's another great way to get green squares. And don't forget, you don't have to write all the tests. You could just write one or two, and it's already adding value, and other people could add some more as well. And then there could be a GitHub action that runs those and checks those as well. So again, remember, little improvements, everyone, they all add up. So that's great.
Amazing. Yeah, that'd be great, and happy to take any PRs.
So I'm very sad we haven't got any PRs today, but people are probably still or paying attention and working on it. Remember, everyone, start raising an issue first. That's a great way to get a green square as well, and then someone else can raise a PR. But if you want to do it, do say that you're going to do it as well.
In the main Cerbos repo, we actually have a good first issue tag.
Nice.
For kind of newcomers, which in this case there's one for like updating our Helm repository. So if you're learning Kubernetes and Helm charts, we'd love to take contributions for that. But there's 25 open issues at the moment on this repo, and this is in Go. But our demo repos as well are always looking for input, and our JavaScript SDK as well. If you want to go and poke around the JavaScript side of things, around how the actual SDK works, it's also open source, like everything else we do.
That's great. I love it. Open source, definitely. Music to my ears. I love that. And the demo projects are just so good because people will use to start. A lot of people use documentation, which is super important. But demo projects, it just seems people want to play with it, get it working, and then they'll start kind of copying and pasting things over. So yes, Indeed. Everyone watching, go and improve the demo project as well. You got some fuller examples I see in your playground.
Yeah, I was going to show you a broken test so you can see what the
yes,
output
please
looks
do.
like. There we go. So right here in the bottom, sorry, it's a bit small. Ooh. It shows you that in this particular test, this principal, this resource, this action expected to deny, it actually got an allow.
Awesome. And then is there a command that we can run on the command line to run this, to do run these checks as well? Yeah.
So this basically behind the scenes, the playground is just running the CLI with some few extra bits. But if you head over to our documentation, it shows you how to kind of run all your tests as well.
That sounds good. And then we can run it locally and can also run it on a GitHub action as well to make sure it all passes before being merged in the way we like it. So what does everyone think? For the people who are still here, what do you think? I think this is really interesting that it's an abstraction, but it's an abstraction with a whole ecosystem. You've thought about, Docker, you thought about the playground, so people can just start playing with it and using it. And you thought about, the Kubernetes side, you thought about the GitHub action side and the testing. I really love that. So how long has the project been around for?
So the first open source release was just about a year ago now.
Oh, so it's quite new. Okay, wow. You've been busy.
Yeah. But the response from the community has been great. There's loads of startups using it, as well as there's multi-billion-dollar enterprise companies using Servos today out there in production. So every single bit of feedback we get, we have a Slack community rather than Discord community, but you can find that if you just go to the Servos website. We as like a maintenance team, we have like 24/7 coverage because we have some people in New Zealand, we have people in Europe, we have people in the US, and everything is built in the open. We accept PRs from anyone that takes their time to contribute. We want this thing to go from strength to strength. And any edge case, anything you get stuck on, I'm more than happy. We jump on calls and do policy workshops with users where I'm happy to jump on a call and you basically talk at me about your business requirements and we'll code live in the playground here and you'll walk away with a policy for your application to get going with.
That's awesome. And I have another question now you just made me think of when you talked about, playground and calls. I love calls, love pairing, but sometimes you want to do things asynchronously. If, say, for example, I've created a playground to play with things for one of the Eddie Hub projects, and I'm stuck on something, I can send you a GitHub link as well. Can I put the playground in the README so if someone wants to play with the playground or can I share it with you? Does it work? Are the playgrounds private? Are they public? How does that work?
Yeah, so every playground's got a unique URL, so you can share those around. In fact, Perfect. In this demo repo, there's a link off to the particular playground instance in the docs here.
Brilliant.
Only the person that created the playground can edit it. Anyone else gets the option to sort of copy it and mute it and build on top of it.
Got you. Perfect. That makes sense. I think that's great. Anything else you'd like to cover? I know I've been chatting for quite a while. Anything else you'd like to include?
Really, we just all ears for any sort of feedback. Anything that feels hard to do or complicated and not clear, please drop me a message. I'm in the Discord now with you guys, so I'll keep an eye on that more. Equally, just raise an issue on GitHub. Any contribution of any size is welcome. And if you want more of a pairing session to get going, yeah, just let us know.
Sounds good. Yeah, you joined our Discord today, which is great. You're going to get very friendly with our EddieBot because you said guys, and EddieBot is going to flag that up and say it's not inclusive language. Please use folks or people or something like that. So this is going to be fun and interesting. It takes a while to get used to, but we kind of eventually get there. So Alex, thank you so much. I've just shared the Cerbos website again because it's got some amazing documentation diagrams on there as well. And you can get access to the GitHub repo, the playground, all that sorts of stuff. Let me know in Discord, all of you, what you're playing with and what you've used it for. And even just playing with it just to get started. And if you're familiar with our link-free project, then let us know what you think would be good rules to have. Do we need certain admins who can help people update their profiles? What do we need to do for that? Let us know what you think. In Discord, we can chat about that. Start maybe a GitHub discussion on a link-free project about authorization. I think that'd be a good way to get a green square, and also to have that discussion and not lose it too much in Discord. But any questions, Alex is around on our Discord as well. So Alex, thank you so much again for joining. I learned so much, and I'm super excited. And it's awesome, and it's open source. I mean, that's like the best win. That's why I actually have a banner here which says collaboration first, code second. It was super excited. And don't forget to also follow Alex on Twitter as well. Shared that before too. I think you've been tagged in lots of things already with me in my timeline. I'm going to go through and retweet. I'm just going to share your Twitter in the chat as well if anyone wants to follow you and see what you're up to as well. Alex, thank you so much again. I'm going to bring up the holding countdown, and if you can hang on for a few more minutes, I'll say thank you to you after the live stream as well. Everyone, thank you so much for joining, and thank you, Alex.
Thanks.
Everyone, have a good weekend.